Okay, a question here from Mark Latore. Could you talk about the difference between Asian and European pattern welding techniques? Well, could I? I could only say, again, this is not answering the question, but this is related to the question, and this is something that comes up in a lot of videos. A lot of people seem to confuse woots with pattern welding because of the misuse of the word Damascus steel. Modern knife makers, when they say Damascus steel, usually mean pattern welding. However, Damascus, the original Damascus steel, was not pattern welded. It was crucible steel, it was woots. Now, the problem therefore is when people talk about Damascus steel, you never really know, unless you question them further, you never really know whether they're talking about woots steel, the old Damascus steel, that was actually, for the most part, made in India and traded through to Syria and was famously made into swords in Damascus. You don't know whether they're talking about that or whether they're talking about pattern welding, and this is also, the gun trade as well has confused it, because even from the late 19th century, shotgun barrels were often made via pattern welding, because they looked nice, partly, but also because there was a perception that it made for a stronger gun barrel. In actual fact, that's debatable, and a monosteel, a very good monosteel gun barrel, is probably stronger than a pattern welded gun barrel. But there was the perception that pattern welding was really top quality, so people sought it out, and of course it does look very pretty. So lots of top quality shotgun barrels did have, and rifle barrels as well, and pistols and so on, had pattern welded barrels, and these were often known in the trade as Damascus barrels. So it's an incredibly confused topic, and that's why, the reason why I've said all this before answering the question is because I'm not 100% sure whether the poster is talking about woots or pattern welding. But if we take the poster Mark Latore at face value and say the difference between Asian pattern welding and European pattern welding, I can't answer the question off the top of my head, because whilst I know a fair amount about European pattern welding, I don't know very much about Asian pattern welding, I'm afraid. So there we go, other than to say that really the most highly prized composite steel blades in Asia were woots crucible steel, not pattern welded as such. So there's a good question here from Cold Steel Fanboy Katana Lover, who, given that they're a Cold Steel Fanboy Katana Lover, I'm impressed that you're a subscriber, and thank you for subscribing to my videos, despite the fact that I've, in some circles, been known as bashing on Cold Steel and bashing on katanas. They have said perhaps you can talk about the fear of not doing your duty on the battlefield during the late Middle Ages. What would happen if you ran away in the middle of a battle, and what did people believe were the consequences from God if they did not do their duty to vanquish their evil enemies? I think that's a complicated question. So it's trying to get to the idea of fear of God and religiousness in running away. To be honest, I can't remember off the top of my head ever seeing God referenced in fleeing from the enemy in a medieval context. It's surprising actually, in the medieval treatises, and this is obviously the area of medieval history where I've probably got the most specialist knowledge, God is actually referred to surprisingly, or surprisingly to me at least, surprisingly little. God is mentioned in the medieval treatises, and it's sometimes with the context of, you know, God give me courage, and if God wills it, then I will be triumphant. The concept of trial by battle or trial by combat, as it's more commonly known these days. So obviously if we look at something like Talhofer or Pallas Carl, then there's the subject of trial by combat to decide a judicial case. So in that case, you're literally putting your life and your righteousness into the hands of God, and you're fighting someone else. Now, what's weird about the trial by combat thing is one person knew that they were false, and yet they still, you know, they still went and fought, because in many cases someone who was wrong and under the eyes of God, even if they, and I'm sure that there were atheist people in the medieval period who obviously didn't openly admit that they were atheist, but there must have been at least 50% of people who went into judicial combat cases. Or I suppose some people maybe were. In many judicial combat cases, I suppose neither person was really right or wrong, and it was, I suppose, yeah, I'm colouring it too black and white here. In many cases, people went for trial by combat believing they were right, but in actual fact, perhaps each person was a little bit right and a little bit wrong, or each person was right from a certain perspective. I suppose that's true. So, but nevertheless, there must have been a lot of people who did nevertheless enter trial by combat knowing that they were false, you know, knowing that they were a murderer or a rapist or a thief or whatever, but believing in their own combat skills and hoping that they'd come out of it alive. And clearly, you know, those people weren't too concerned about what would happen in the afterlife. I can't remember ever seeing any direct references to the fear of godly retribution for running away in battle. Very clearly, vastly more people ran away in battle in the medieval period than were killed in battle. We just know that statistically. You know, if you look at the Battle of Towton, for example, which was probably the bloodiest battle fought on British soil, in 1471 during the Wars of the Roses, we know a huge number of people were killed at the Battle of Towton, but we also know that a vast number of those people who were killed while they were running away. They were fleeing. And I don't think that fleeing was seen in the same way as some people would see it today, maybe, because if you flee, you live to fight another day, and running away is very often a tactical withdrawal, and it's become a joke in I suppose in, you know, computer game circles or modern kind of civilian circles to see tactical withdrawal as like a polite speak for running away, but there's not necessarily anything wrong with running away. Standing and dying, and therefore, you know, if you and your lord die, you can't defend your cause anymore. So your lands might fall into enemy hands, there's no one left to defend those lands, or your cause, or whether it's religious cause or political cause or claim to the throne or whatever else. So running away isn't necessarily inherently a bad thing. Sometimes running away can be exactly the right thing to do. And you know, you could say it's better to run away almost at the start of a battle than later on when you've lost soldiers. If you run away near the beginning, you've still got lots of soldiers left, assuming you all get away, and you can fight on another day when you might win. So no, I think there's a few things at play in that question which mean that I can't really answer it. Firstly, I don't really know. I haven't seen any explicit medieval sources referring to the fear of God being connected to running away. Rather, it's more fear of the living, or fear of mortal men for running away, because if you run away and abandon your lord, and your lord wins, he might hunt down deserters and punish them. However, if you run away and your lord dies, who have you got to be scared of, to be honest? It's unlikely that, you know, if you run away, it's very, in the medieval period there were no records for the opposing side to really identify you, and yes, unless you had a wound from battle, there was no way to identify you as someone who'd run away. You'd just go back to your civilian life, or just keep on running and go to a land where that wasn't an issue. So yeah, there we go. That's the best I can come up with for that question.